He left her because she was poor, then saw her on Forbes. The magazine fell from Marcus Chen's trembling hands onto the marble floor of his Manhattan penthouse, the glossy pages splaying open to reveal a face that had haunted his dreams for 3 years, 3 months, and 17 days. Sarah Martinez stared back at him from the Forbes cover, her dark eyes holding secrets he never knew existed, her smile radiant beneath the bold headline reading, "The Mysterious Billionaire Who Changed Everything." Marcus stumbled backward, his Armani suit suddenly feeling like a straitjacket, his breathing shallow and rapid. The woman he had abandoned in that dingy Chicago apartment, the woman he had called a burden, a liability, a dead weight on his ambitions, was now worth more than the GDP of small countries. The same woman who had cried when he packed his bags, who had begged him to stay, who had whispered that love was worth more than money, was now staring at him from the cover of the most prestigious business magazine in America. He picked up the magazine with shaking hands, his wedding ring, the one meant for someone else now, catching the light from the floor-to-ceiling windows. The article began with words that made his blood run cold. Sarah Martinez appeared from nowhere 3 years ago, acquiring failing businesses with cash payments that raised eyebrows across Wall Street, transforming them into gold mines with methods that defied conventional wisdom. The apartment fell silent except for the distant hum of Manhattan traffic 40 floors below. Marcus remembered that night in Chicago, the night he had destroyed everything, the night he had chosen Jennifer Walsh, the pharmaceutical heiress, over Sarah. He had been so certain, so smugly confident that he was trading up, that Sarah's thrift store clothes and bus pass represented a life of mediocrity he refused to accept. The magazine trembled in his hands as he read further. Sources close to Martinez describe her as intensely private, almost secretive, with a past she refuses to discuss and business practices that border on the supernatural, though her results speak louder than her silence. The article mentioned her Chicago origins, her sudden disappearance from the city 3 years ago, her mysterious emergence in Silicon Valley with resources that seemed to materialize from thin air. Marcus's phone buzzed against the glass coffee table, Jennifer's name flashing on the screen, but he couldn't move, couldn't think, couldn't process anything beyond the growing horror that he had made the biggest mistake of his life. The woman he had dismissed as poor, as worthless, as beneath his station, had been hiding something massive, something that would have changed everything if he had just trusted her, if he had just stayed. The memory came flooding back with violent clarity, that last argument in Sarah's cramped apartment above the Korean restaurant, the smell of kimchi and disappointment thick in the air. She had tried to tell him something that night, had started to say, "Marcus, there's something you need to know about my family, about why I live like this," but he had cut her off, had thrown his hands up in exasperation, had declared that he couldn't build a future with someone who couldn't even afford decent furniture. He had stormed out into the Chicago snow, leaving her standing in the doorway wearing that oversized sweater, her face streaked with tears, her mouth open as if she still had something crucial to say. 3 weeks later, he had moved to New York, married Jennifer in a ceremony that cost more than most people's houses, and built what he thought was the perfect life with the perfect wife who came with the perfect trust fund. But now, staring at Sarah's face on the Forbes cover, Marcus realized that perfect was a word that tasted like ashes in his mouth. The article continued with details that made his head spin. Martinez's investment firm, Phoenix Ventures, has an unprecedented success rate, having turned every single acquisition into a billion-dollar enterprise within 18 months, a feat that has financial analysts calling her either the luckiest person alive or something far more extraordinary. Marcus's hands shook as he read about her charitable foundation, her anonymous donations to struggling families in Chicago, her scholarship program for underprivileged students, her housing projects that had transformed entire neighborhoods. This was the woman he had called selfish, the woman he had accused of having no ambition, no drive, no vision for the future. The phone buzzed again, this time showing a text from Jennifer. "Where are you, darling? The Hamptons house won't decorate itself for the charity gala." Marcus stared at the message, thinking about the hundreds of similar galas they had attended, the endless parade of shallow conversations and meaningless networking, the way Jennifer's friends always looked at him like he was an accessory, expensive but ultimately replaceable. He scrolled through his contacts until he found Sarah's old number, the one he had never deleted despite telling himself 1,000 times that he should. His finger hovered over the call button for what felt like hours, his heart hammering against his ribs, his mouth dry as dust. What could he possibly say to her now, what words could bridge the chasm he had created with his greed and stupidity and cowardice? The magazine article mentioned that Sarah had been spotted in Chicago recently, buying the entire block where her old apartment used to be, tearing down the buildings to create a community center and affordable housing complex. She had returned to the place where he had broken her heart, had transformed it into something beautiful and meaningful, had made it better than it ever was when they were together. Marcus closed his eyes and remembered the way Sarah used to look at him, with such trust and hope and unconditional love that it had almost frightened him. She had never asked him for anything except his presence, his attention, his commitment to building something real together. She had been content with their tiny apartment, their second-hand furniture, their quiet evenings reading books from the library and cooking meals from ingredients they bought with coupons. But he had wanted more, had needed more, had convinced himself that more was always better, that success was measured in dollars and social status and the admiration of people whose names appeared in gossip columns. He had been so focused on the ladder he was climbing that he had never stopped to wonder if it was leaning against the right wall. The Forbes article included a quote from an anonymous source that made Marcus's stomach lurch with recognition. "She once told me that the people who matter most are the ones who love you when you have nothing, who stay when staying is hard, who choose you over easier options. But she also said that most people fail that test, that most people reveal their true nature when money becomes part of the equation." Marcus knew with absolute certainty that he had been one of those people, that he had failed Sarah's test so completely and spectacularly that she had probably expected it, had probably seen it coming long before he had packed his bags and walked out of her life forever. The thought that she might have been testing him, measuring his character against his ambition, made him feel sick and small and utterly defeated. His phone rang, interrupting his spiral of self-recrimination, and Jennifer's face appeared on the screen, beautiful and perfectly composed and completely oblivious to the earthquake that was tearing through her husband's carefully constructed world. Marcus stared at the phone until it stopped ringing, then immediately started again, then stopped, then started once more with the insistence of someone who was not accustomed to being ignored. He walked to the window and looked out at the city that had promised him everything, the city where he had built his career and his reputation and his marriage, the city that now felt like a glittering prison. Somewhere in this maze of steel and glass and ambition, Sarah was probably sitting in a boardroom or a corner office, making decisions that would affect thousands of lives, wielding power and influence that he could never have imagined when he knew her. The magazine had fallen open to a 2-page spread showing Sarah at various charity events, always dressed simply but elegantly, always surrounded by people who looked at her with genuine respect and admiration. In one photo, she was reading to children at a library she had funded. In another, she was breaking ground on a homeless shelter. In a third, she was shaking hands with the mayor of Chicago at the opening of a free medical clinic. Marcus tried to reconcile these images with his memories of the woman who had worn the same 3 outfits to work, who had clipped coupons from the Sunday paper, who had saved quarters in a mason jar to buy coffee from the vending machine at her data entry job. The disconnect was so complete, so jarring, that he wondered if he had ever really known her at all, or if he had been so blinded by his own prejudices and assumptions that he had seen only what he expected to see. The article mentioned that Sarah's wealth had appeared suddenly and mysteriously, with no clear source or explanation, leading to speculation about inheritance, lottery winnings, or more exotic possibilities. Financial reporters had traced her money back only so far before hitting walls of privacy and legal barriers that suggested resources far beyond what any individual should possess. Marcus felt a chill that had nothing to do with the air conditioning as he read about the businesses Sarah had acquired, companies that had been failing for years before she touched them, enterprises that had defied every economic principle and market prediction to become wildly successful under her guidance. The article quoted economists who used words like impossible and unprecedented and supernatural to describe her track record. He remembered the night Sarah had tried to explain her family history, the night he had been too impatient and too arrogant to listen, the night he had dismissed her words as excuses and her background as irrelevant. She had mentioned relatives in South America, old money tied to mining and agriculture, assets that were complicated to access and difficult to explain. He had rolled his eyes and changed the subject, had told her that he didn't care about her family's fairy tales, that he needed to focus on reality and practical matters. The magazine slipped from his numb fingers again, landing with a soft thud on the expensive Persian rug that Jennifer had chosen because it matched their expensive furniture in their expensive apartment that now felt like a mausoleum of poor choices and missed opportunities. Marcus sank into the leather chair that cost more than Sarah's rent used to be, his head in his hands, his mind reeling with the magnitude of what he had lost. Jennifer's key turned in the lock, and Marcus heard her heels clicking across the marble entryway, heard her calling his name with the slight irritation she always displayed when he failed to answer her calls or texts immediately. She appeared in the doorway wearing a designer dress that cost more than most people's monthly salary, her perfectly styled hair and flawless makeup creating an image of success and sophistication that had once impressed him beyond measure. "There you are," Jennifer said, her voice carrying the tone of someone addressing a wayward pet. "I've been trying to reach you for hours. We need to leave for the Hamptons in 20 minutes, and you're not even dressed properly." She paused, noticing the magazine on the floor, Sarah's face staring up at both of them like an accusation. "What's this?" Marcus looked up at his wife, this woman he had chosen over Sarah, this woman who represented everything he had thought he wanted, and felt nothing but a hollow ache where his heart used to be. "It's a Forbes magazine," he said quietly, his voice barely audible above the hum of the air conditioning. Jennifer picked up the magazine, her expression shifting from irritation to curiosity to something that might have been recognition. "She looks familiar," she said, studying Sarah's photograph with the calculating gaze she usually reserved for potential investments or social rivals. "Wasn't she that little nobody you used to date in Chicago, the one with the terrible apartment and the sad job?" The words hit Marcus like physical blows, each one a reminder of his own blindness and cruelty, each one a testament to the poison that had infected his thinking and his values and his ability to see what truly mattered. "She wasn't a nobody," he said, his voice stronger now, filled with a conviction that surprised him. "She was everything, and I was too stupid to realize it." Jennifer's perfectly plucked eyebrows rose in surprise, and she looked from the magazine to Marcus and back again, her expression shifting to something that might have been alarm. "Marcus, darling, you're being dramatic. Surely you don't mean to suggest that this woman, this Sarah person, actually matters in any meaningful way to our life together." But Marcus was no longer listening to Jennifer's words, was no longer present in their perfect apartment with their perfect view and their perfect life that had turned out to be perfectly empty. He was remembering Sarah's laugh, the way it had filled their tiny apartment with warmth and joy, the way it had made him feel like he was the funniest, most interesting, most important person in the world. He was remembering the way Sarah had looked at him when he came home from work, like he was a gift she hadn't expected to receive, like his presence in her life was a miracle she never took for granted. He was remembering the way she had supported his dreams even when they meant sacrifices for her, the way she had believed in his potential even when he doubted himself, the way she had loved him completely and unconditionally until the moment he walked away. The magazine article mentioned that Sarah Martinez had never married, had never been publicly linked to anyone romantically, had devoted herself entirely to her business ventures and charitable works. Marcus wondered if she had ever loved anyone else after him, if she had ever trusted anyone else with her heart, if she had ever looked at another man the way she had once looked at him. "I have to go," Marcus said suddenly, standing up from the chair, the Forbes magazine still in his hands, Sarah's face still staring up at him with those dark eyes that held secrets he was only beginning to understand. Jennifer stepped back, her perfectly composed facade cracking slightly to reveal something that might have been panic. "Go where, Marcus? We have obligations, commitments, people are expecting us at the Hamptons. You can't just disappear because you saw a picture of some old girlfriend in a magazine." But Marcus was already moving toward the bedroom, already pulling clothes from his closet, already making plans that had nothing to do with charity galas or summer houses or the life he had built on the foundation of Sarah's broken heart. He was going to Chicago, going to find her, going to face the woman he had abandoned and the future he had destroyed and the truth he had been too cowardly to hear. "Marcus, stop this nonsense immediately," Jennifer commanded, her voice rising to the pitch she used when she was truly angry, when she was facing the possibility of not getting her way. "You're having some sort of midlife crisis, some sort of temporary insanity brought on by seeing an old photograph, but you need to think about what you're doing, about what you're risking, about what you stand to lose." Marcus paused in his packing, a shirt halfway into his suitcase, and looked at Jennifer with eyes that seemed to be seeing her clearly for the first time in 3 years. She was beautiful, accomplished, connected, everything he had thought he wanted in a wife, but she was also cold, calculating, emotionally unavailable, and utterly incapable of the kind of love that Sarah had offered him so freely. "What am I losing, Jennifer?" Marcus asked, his voice quiet and steady, What exactly am I risking by walking away from this? He gestured around the apartment, at the expensive furniture and the designer accessories and the perfectly curated life that felt more like a museum exhibit than a home. Jennifer's mouth opened and closed several times, her carefully crafted arguments apparently failing her in the face of his unexpected directness. You're losing everything we've built together, she finally managed, your position in society, your business connections, your financial security, your reputation, everything that matters. But Marcus was already shaking his head, already understanding that everything she had listed was external, superficial, ultimately meaningless if it wasn't built on a foundation of genuine love and mutual respect and shared values. None of that matters without love, he said, surprised by his own clarity. None of that means anything if it's not real. He finished packing in silence while Jennifer alternated between pleading and threatening, between promising changes she would never make and warning of consequences that no longer frightened him. When he was done, he stood in the doorway of their bedroom, looking back at the life he was leaving behind, feeling nothing but relief and a strange sense of coming home to himself. If you walk out that door, Jennifer said, her voice cold and final, don't expect to come back, don't expect me to wait for you, don't expect anything from me ever again. Marcus nodded, understanding that this was probably the most honest thing she had ever said to him, the most genuine emotion she had ever displayed in their relationship. I know, he said, and then he walked out of their apartment, out of their marriage, out of the life that had never really been his anyway. The flight to Chicago gave him time to think, to plan, to wrestle with the question of what he would say to Sarah when he found her, how he would explain his presence in her life after 3 years of absence, how he would convince her to give him even 5 minutes of her time. The Forbes article had mentioned that she was in Chicago for the opening of her community center, the one built on the site of their old neighborhood, the one that was scheduled to open tomorrow morning. Marcus rented a car at O'Hare and drove through the city he had fled 3 years ago, past the landmarks that held memories of his time with Sarah, past the restaurant where they had their first date, past the park where they had walked on Sunday mornings, past the library where they had spent countless hours reading together in comfortable silence. Chicago looked different now, or maybe he was different, maybe his eyes had been opened by loss and regret and the crushing weight of understanding what he had thrown away. He found a hotel near the old neighborhood, a place that was nicer than anywhere he and Sarah had ever been able to afford together, a place that reminded him of the gap between who he had been then and who he had become since. The irony wasn't lost on him that he now had the money to give Sarah the kind of life he had once thought she deserved, but she no longer needed him to give her anything, had built her own empire, had created her own version of success that dwarfed his own achievements. The community center was impressive, a modern building with clean lines and large windows, surrounded by affordable housing units and green spaces that transformed what had once been a run-down block into something vibrant and hopeful. Marcus stood across the street at 6 in the morning, watching the preparations for the opening ceremony, watching workers hang banners and set up chairs and test sound systems. And then he saw her, stepping out of a black SUV with tinted windows, wearing a simple blue dress that somehow made her look more elegant than Jennifer had ever looked in her designer gowns. Sarah Martinez moved through the crowd of workers and officials with quiet confidence, speaking to everyone, shaking hands, checking details, making sure everything was perfect for the people who would benefit from this place she had created. Marcus felt his breath catch in his throat as he watched her, as he saw the woman he had known transformed into someone powerful and successful and completely self-possessed. She looked older, of course, but also stronger, more confident, more at peace with herself than she had ever been when they were together. This was a woman who had found her purpose, who had claimed her power, who had built something meaningful with her life. The opening ceremony began at 10 o'clock, with speeches from local officials and community leaders, with a ribbon cutting that was covered by local news crews and attended by hundreds of people whose lives would be touched by Sarah's generosity. Marcus stood at the back of the crowd, close enough to hear her voice when she spoke, far enough away to remain invisible in the sea of faces. Sarah's speech was brief and heartfelt, focused on the community rather than herself, on the future rather than the past, on hope rather than the pain that had driven her away from this place 3 years ago. She spoke about second chances and new beginnings, about the importance of investing in people rather than just buildings, about the power of love to transform not just individuals but entire neighborhoods. Marcus felt tears running down his cheeks as he listened to her words, as he understood that everything she was saying was also a message about forgiveness, about moving forward, about refusing to let the past define the future. She had taken the pain he had caused her and transformed it into something beautiful, had used her heartbreak as fuel for healing not just herself but an entire community. When the ceremony ended, Marcus watched Sarah move through the crowd, greeting people, taking photos, listening to stories from families who would benefit from the services the center would provide. She was surrounded by people who clearly loved and respected her, people who saw her as a hero rather than a victim, people who had been touched by her generosity and her vision. Marcus waited until the crowd began to thin, until the officials and the news crews had gone, until Sarah was alone with just a few staff members, reviewing the day's events and planning for tomorrow. He approached slowly, his heart pounding, his mouth dry, his hands shaking with the weight of everything he needed to say and the fear that it was too little, too late. Sarah looked up as he approached, and for a moment, her composure faltered, her professional mask slipping to reveal something raw and vulnerable and achingly familiar. They stood facing each other in the afternoon sun, 3 years and a lifetime of regret between them, the community center rising behind them like a monument to everything he had lost. "Hello, Sarah," Marcus said, his voice barely audible above the sound of traffic and construction and the distant laughter of children playing in the new playground. "Hello, Marcus," she replied, her voice steady but soft, her dark eyes searching his face for clues about why he was there, what he wanted, what he hoped to accomplish by appearing in her life like a ghost from a past she had worked so hard to overcome. They stood in silence for what felt like hours, two people who had once known each other completely, who had shared dreams and fears and the kind of intimacy that only comes from loving someone without reservation. Now they were strangers, separated by choices and time and the different people they had become since their last painful goodbye. "I saw the Forbes article," Marcus said finally, the words coming out in a rush. "I saw your picture, and I realized what I had done, what I had thrown away, what a fool I had been to leave you." Sarah's expression didn't change, but something flickered in her eyes, something that might have been pain or anger or simply exhaustion at having to revisit wounds she thought had healed. "You left because you thought I was poor," she said quietly. "You left because you wanted more than I could give you, more than our life together could provide." Marcus shook his head violently, his hands reaching toward her before dropping back to his sides when he saw her step backward. "I left because I was stupid and blind and selfish," he said, his voice breaking with emotion. "I left because I couldn't see past my own ambition and greed and fear of being ordinary." "You left because you didn't love me enough to stay," Sarah said, and her words were like a knife to his heart, precise and true and cutting straight to the core of his failure. "You left because when it came down to choosing between love and money, between me and your idea of success, you chose what you thought would make you happy." Marcus felt the truth of her words settle over him like a weight, crushing and undeniable and absolutely accurate. He had chosen money over love, status over substance, the promise of an easier life over the reality of a meaningful one. He had failed the test she had mentioned in the Forbes article, had revealed his true nature when money became part of the equation. "I was wrong," he said, his voice barely a whisper. "I was wrong about everything, about what mattered, about what success looked like, about what would make me happy. I've spent 3 years in a marriage that feels like a business arrangement, in a life that looks perfect but feels empty, wondering what would have happened if I had just trusted you, if I had just stayed." Sarah looked at him for a long moment, her expression unreadable, her hands clasped in front of her in a gesture he remembered from their time together, something she did when she was thinking deeply or trying to control her emotions. "You want to know what would have happened if you had stayed," she said finally. "You want to know what you would have learned if you had listened to me that night instead of walking away." Marcus nodded, not trusting his voice, not daring to hope that she might actually tell him, might actually share the secrets that had been locked away for 3 years, the truth that might have changed everything if he had been willing to hear it. Sarah turned away from him, looking at the community center, at the children playing in the playground, at the families beginning to gather for the evening programs that would start next week. "My family has money," she said, her voice so quiet he had to lean closer to hear her. "More money than you could ever imagine, old money that goes back generations, money that comes with responsibilities and expectations and a kind of visibility that I never wanted." Marcus felt his legs grow weak, felt the full weight of his mistake settling over him like a crushing avalanche. "Why didn't you tell me?" he whispered. "Why did you live like that? Why did you let me think you were struggling financially?" Sarah turned back to him, and her eyes were bright with unshed tears, her composure finally cracking to reveal the pain she had been carrying for 3 years. Because I wanted to know if you would love me without it, she said. Because I had been hurt before by people who only wanted my money. Because I thought you were different. Because I hoped you would choose me for who I was rather than what I could give you. The words hit Marcus like physical blows, each one a reminder of how completely he had failed her, how thoroughly he had proven himself to be exactly the kind of person she had been trying to avoid. She had tested him, and he had failed spectacularly, had revealed himself to be shallow and mercenary and unworthy of the love she had offered so freely. "I'm sorry," he said, the words feeling inadequate and pathetic in the face of what he had done. "I'm sorry for not listening, for not trusting you, for not being the man you needed me to be. I'm sorry for hurting you, for disappointing you, for proving that you were right to be cautious about sharing your heart." Sarah wiped a tear from her cheek, and Marcus saw that her hands were shaking slightly, that this conversation was costing her something, that revisiting their past was opening wounds she had worked hard to heal. "I loved you," she said, her voice breaking. "I loved you so much that I was willing to risk everything, to trust you with the truth about my family, to build a life together that would have been worth more than all the money in the world." Marcus felt his own tears flowing freely now, felt the full weight of his loss settling over him like a blanket of regret and sorrow and devastating understanding. "I loved you too," he said. "I love you still. I've never stopped loving you, but I was too stupid and too scared to see what I had, too focused on what I thought I wanted to appreciate what I actually needed." They stood together in the fading afternoon light, two people who had once been everything to each other, who had shared a love that could have lasted forever if one of them hadn't been too blind to see its value. The community center rose behind them, Sarah's gift to the neighborhood where their love had died, her way of transforming pain into purpose, loss into healing. "It's too late," Sarah said finally, her voice steady again, her professional composure returning like armor against the vulnerability of their shared past. "Too much time has passed, too much has changed. Too much damage has been done for us to go back to what we were." Marcus nodded, understanding that she was right, that some mistakes were too big to undo, that some choices created consequences that lasted forever. He had chosen Jennifer and money and status over Sarah and love and authenticity, and now he would have to live with that choice for the rest of his life. But as he looked at Sarah, at the woman she had become, at the empire she had built and the lives she had changed and the community she had transformed, Marcus felt something that might have been pride mixed with his regret. She had taken the pain he had caused her and turned it into something beautiful, had used his betrayal as fuel for becoming the kind of person who changed the world rather than just complained about it. "I'm proud of you," he said, his voice soft but clear. "I'm proud of what you've built, what you've accomplished, what you've become. You're everything I always knew you could be, everything I was too blind to see when it mattered." Sarah looked at him with surprise, as if she hadn't expected him to say anything that wasn't focused on his own regret and loss. "Thank you," she said quietly, "that means more to me than you might think, coming from someone who knew me before all of this, who saw me when I was just trying to figure out who I was supposed to be." They talked for another hour as the sun set behind the Chicago skyline, sharing stories about the lives they had built since their separation, the lessons they had learned, the people they had become. Marcus told her about his hollow marriage, his successful but meaningless career, his growing realization that he had traded everything that mattered for things that ultimately didn't. Sarah told him about her business ventures, her charitable work, her decision to use her family's wealth to make a difference rather than just accumulate more money. When it was time to say goodbye, they stood facing each other one last time, two people who had loved each other completely and lost each other forever, two people who would carry the weight of what might have been for the rest of their lives. Marcus wanted to touch her, to hold her, to somehow bridge the gap that his choices had created, but he knew that some distances couldn't be crossed, that some damage couldn't be undone. "I hope you find happiness," Sarah said, her voice gentle and sincere. "I hope you find someone who loves you the way you deserve to be loved, someone who sees your heart rather than your bank account, someone who makes you want to be the best version of yourself." Marcus nodded, knowing that he would probably never find another Sarah, that he had already had his chance at the kind of love that changed everything, and he had thrown it away for the promise of something that had turned out to be nothing at all. "I hope you find happiness too," he said. "I hope you find someone who appreciates what an incredible woman you are, someone who would never make the mistake I made." Sarah smiled then, the first genuine smile he had seen from her all day, and for a moment, she looked like the woman he had fallen in love with all those years ago, the woman who had believed in forever and happy endings and the power of love to overcome any obstacle. Maybe I will, she said. Maybe there's still time for both of us to find what we're looking for. Marcus watched her walk away, watched her disappear into the black SUV that would take her back to her empire and her responsibilities and her life without him. He stood alone in front of the community center as the streetlights began to flicker on, as the neighborhood settled into evening routines, as the weight of his choices settled over him like a familiar burden. He flew back to New York the next morning, back to his empty apartment and his empty marriage and his empty life, carrying with him the image of Sarah as she was now, powerful and successful and completely beyond his reach. Jennifer had moved out while he was gone, taking half their belongings and leaving divorce papers on the kitchen counter, and Marcus felt nothing but relief that he wouldn't have to pretend anymore, wouldn't have to maintain the facade of a happy marriage built on mutual self-interest rather than love. Months later, Marcus would see Sarah's name in the business news again, would read about her latest acquisition or charitable donation or innovative business strategy, and he would feel a mixture of pride and regret that never seemed to fade. She had become everything he had always known she could be, had built the kind of life that mattered, had used her resources to make the world better rather than just to make herself richer. Sometimes, late at night in his empty apartment, Marcus would wonder what their life together would have looked like if he had made different choices, if he had listened to her story about her family, if he had chosen love over money and substance over status. He would imagine their children playing in the community center she had built, would picture them working together to change the world, would dream about the kind of partnership they could have had if he hadn't been so blind to what truly mattered. But mostly, Marcus would remember the way Sarah had looked at him during their last conversation, with forgiveness rather than anger, with compassion rather than contempt, with the kind of grace that only comes from someone who has transformed their pain into purpose. She had loved him completely, had trusted him with her heart, had been willing to share her truth with him, and he had failed her in the most fundamental way possible. The Forbes magazine still sat on his coffee table, Sarah's face still staring up at him with those dark eyes that held secrets he would never fully understand, reminders of the woman he had lost and the future he had destroyed and the kind of love that comes along once in a lifetime, if you're lucky enough to recognize it before it's too late. Marcus had learned that some mistakes are too big to fix, that some choices create consequences that last forever, that some opportunities only come once and must be seized when they appear or lost forever. He had learned that real wealth isn't measured in dollars but in the depth of your relationships, the authenticity of your connections, the love you give and receive from people who matter. But most importantly, Marcus had learned that Sarah Martinez had been right about everything, that the people who matter most are the ones who love you when you have nothing, who stay when staying is hard, who choose you over easier options, and that he had been exactly the kind of person who fails that test, who reveals their true nature when money becomes part of the equation. The story of Marcus and Sarah became a cautionary tale whispered in the corridors of power, a reminder that some prizes are too valuable to trade for anything else, that some people are too precious to lose, that some loves are too rare to survive the poison of greed and ambition and the mistaken belief that happiness can be purchased rather than earned through the patient work of building something real with someone who sees your heart. And in Chicago, in the community center that bore no name but Sarah's quiet influence, children played and families gathered and lives were changed by the generosity of a woman who had taken her broken heart and transformed it into a force for healing, who had proved that love, even lost love, even betrayed love, could still change the world if you were brave enough to let it.